What would you say is the biggest benefit of decriminalization, and what would you say would be the biggest fear if it was run by the government?
I would say the biggest benefit of decriminalization would be that sex workers could stop running from the police, and that what that would mean is that sex workers have equal access to the law, because you don't have equal access to the law when you're criminalized, because no matter what, even if you are a victim of a crime, you end up having your background checked, and then if they realize that you are a criminal as well, then you get treated as a criminal, not a victim of a crime. And that happens a lot with sex workers with regards to violence on the street. They aren't listened to by the police, and they have to be running from the police, and they're getting into situations that are more dangerous. And they can't report things to the police that you normally would. And people take advantage that the law is ambiguous, and that's I think it's important to note that the violence is a result of the ambiguous laws, not a result of the work itself. So having sex in itself isn't a violent act unless it's done in a violent way, unless people are taking advantage of that situation. That's what people tend to do about the laws. And in a legalized system, what our fear would be is that sex workers would be governed, would be owned and governed by the state, and which would mean the state, who's never worked in the industry before, would govern how the industry works, and so it wouldn't necessarily fulfill or sort of address the needs of sex workers and their realities of work and life.
From the way you're describing it, and if I'm wrong on this, please correct me, it sounds like the majority of the laws that exist that affect sex workers aren't really there to protect the sex worker.
I agree. I mean, a lot of them are a lot of policies are supposed to. I mean, they're instilled to protect the sex worker. But when you look at protectionist policies and policies that are meant to protect people, it usually governs the actions of that person. The procuring law is a good example, because it's meant so that somebody cannot make you work in the industry, so they cannot sort of invite you to work into the industry. But what that law really is so that you cannot be inviting people, you cannot necessarily be giving tips on how, like I can't say to someone, come work with me, I work at a good place, because I'd be considered to be procuring. It doesn't protect that person against coercion. There are already coercion laws that exist. It's just a matter of application, and what we find with sex work laws is that they're applied very ambiguously, and depending on what the greater community's needs are. For example, in the summer, when you see a lot of festivals in the city, you'll see the cops really trying to clean the streets, putting a lot of the sex workers in jail, and that's what happens every summer. It's happened this summer again, is a lot of sex workers are finding themselves in jail because the police are under an enormous pressure to clean up, and I say this in quotes, to clean up the streets. They're not necessarily, the laws aren't necessarily being used for escorts, because when people can't see it, it's sort of this not in my backyard attitude, and people can't see it, they're not necessarily fighting too hard to make it go away.
So it sounds like even though the laws exist 24/7 every day of the year, the only time they're enforced is when the government or society around it has a particular reason to use these.
And whether or not that reason is justified. I mean, it's not justified to clean up the streets. It's not justified to put all the sex workers in jail. It's not justified to raid a brothel or to raid a massage parlor, to raid anything, really. I mean, none of that is justified if the act itself shouldn't be considered criminal. But because people have moral issues around sex work and selling sex in general, you find that, I mean, the police will apply those laws more irrationally, I would say.
Before we go to break, there's one more question, and this is to elaborate on what we've been discussing. What are some of the dangers that sex workers face that the Coalition recognizes, whether they be violent or non-violent? Because if the law is not there to protect the sex worker, what are the dangers they face?
I mean, one of the obvious ones is violence, because the law is not there to protect you, and people take advantage of that. A very good example would be Gary Ridgway in Seattle, Washington, 2 years ago, murdered over 30 sex workers. And he was quoted saying, "I killed them because they were prostitutes, because I knew that nobody would look after them and nobody would care if they were gone, and so nobody would ever find me." I mean, thank God he was wrong in the end of all that. He was found. But he killed them because they were prostitutes. And so that, that is what happens. But there's other things that happen too in terms of just occupational health and safety violations. Like at work, you cannot count on having your rights, respected. You cannot ensure that your workplace is clean, or that you're going to get your pay all the time, depending on where you work, or that you're going to be able to get a T4 slip at the end so that you can file your taxes. There's a whole range of dangers. Dangers or injustices, I would call them. I wouldn't call them necessarily dangers. Yeah, I would more call them injustice that sex workers face because the trade itself is not considered legitimate. So.
You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles, and we'll be back right after this.